Walt Disney and his team of animators changed what movies could look like when they introduced Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs as their first ever full-length theatrical animated feature all the way back in 1937. Since then, Disney has paved the way for every other animation studio after them, becoming a giant in the film industry in the process. When people think about animated movies, they typically think about Disney. Not only has it been one of the longest standing studios in Hollywood, but their track record has been pretty solid, and a lot of people have attached childhood memories to their films. If you watch the 2016 or 2018 versions of the Disney Animation Film Era's explained video on this channel before, that's fine, but this video is an updated version of that and is going to go much more in depth than I've ever gone before. As of right now, there are currently 8 Disney animated movie film eras. The movies in each era tend to have common styles and are defined most by the timeline in which they fall. Some changes happen because of economic decisions or because someone left or came into the studio. That being said, it's best if we start at the beginning, going back to the original animated feature in 1937, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which kicked off Disney's Golden Era. The Golden Era, 1937 to 1942. Snow White might have been the first, but the movies in this era also include Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi. Walt was extremely hands-on with these films. He truly believed that animation could be more than cartoons, and he would strive to create moving art, turning animation into high-end, award-winning films. Our perception of these movies today, as we look back into Disney history, would give us the impression that they are and always have been considered masterpieces. But the golden age of Disney animation wasn't as successful as you might think. The Golden Era name means that these are really the gold standard in terms of quality, and the first to be made at Disney, more than it means that they made any actual gold for the company. Despite the promising beginnings of Snow White, which is still one of the biggest box office draws to date when you consider inflation, the majority of the films in this era failed Walt's artistic dreams, lost the company money. In fact, Fantasia was such a financial flop that they turned what was supposed to be a short cartoon with Dumbo into a full-length feature. It was cheaply made with very little dialogue, quick animation, and it has the shortest runtime of any of Disney's animated films. Had it not been for the financial success of Dumbo and the money that would later come in from doing propaganda pieces for World War II, the studio would have been done by the early 1940s. Besides being called the Golden Era or the Golden Age, this era is also nicknamed the Tar and Sugar Age. And that's due to its contrasting use of cutesy characters and heartwarming scenes, juxtaposed with scares and terrifying backdrops. We often think of Disney movies as safe and family-friendly, but there are many scenes in these 5 movies that really wouldn't fly in modern Disney filmmaking. Scenes like Pinocchio at Pleasure Island, drinking and smoking until he and his friends turn into donkeys. Or the skeletons riding through the night at Bald Mountain in Fantasia. Dumbo getting drunk and seeing pink elephants on parade. And of course, Bambi's mom disappearing after gunfire disrupts the forest. All of these films came out before the rating system that we're all familiar with, and many people would consider them general rated or G-rated films because they're animated. But I'd argue that all of these films have enough scary and dark imagery in them that they would at least get a PG rating or even a PG-13 rating in modern times. And despite consistently losing money at the box office, Walt Disney was persistent in making his full-length animation feature dreams work. He could have easily fallen back on what worked previously, continuing to make Mickey Mouse shorts that made money. But he saw the promise his ideas had, and kept moving forward. The Golden Age and its films are revered because they broke barriers. They turned short cartoons made cheaply into stunning works of art that rivaled the live-action movies of the time. The studio began integrating color, sound, and music to show the world what animated features could be. and we now look back at these films as masterpieces. Unfortunately, we wouldn't do the same for the next era. The Wartime Era, which lasted from 1943 through 1949, includes films such as Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, Make Mine Music, Fun and Fancy Free, Melody Time, and The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. This was an experimental and strange time for Disney animation. The US government occupied the Disney studio and paid Walt to help with World War II. The company was paid money in exchange for propaganda short films and for Walt Disney and a small crew to travel to South America on a Goodwill Ambassador tour. The money they took from the government allowed them to try new ideas. Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros were more educational and put live actors and cartoon characters on the screen together, something that Walt had tried and been successful with in previous years with his Alice comedies. Segments from other movies saw animators try out more rotoscoping, a style of tracing onto animated cells, or segments that saw hands drawing on screen. The Wartime Era is also referred to as the package film era. Rather than taking one full-length animated film to experiment with, these films are often chopped up into shorts. Each of these shorts was made cheaply and quickly, but really did give animators the freedom to do whatever they wanted. Disney opted to take several of these shorts, package them together, and put out a full-length film. That's why it's the package film era. Saludos Amigos and The Three Caballeros are unique in this era because of the reason that they were made. Like I said previously, Walt Disney was commissioned by the US Department of State to take a goodwill tour of South America. These two films that came from that visit were an act of diplomacy, as well as a tribute to the love Walt's team gained for the people and countries that they visited. The rest of the films in this era were more or less just to keep the studio afloat, experimenting and trying new things for the future. The unfortunate part of this era is that none of these films really made any money. Due to the war, none of these films could have a true international appeal, at least not to the scale of the previous films from the Golden Era. The loss of the international market was a guarantee that the wartime films would likely lose money. That's not to mention that the US box office wasn't doing as well either. Many men were off to war, and women were put to work for the first time in the country's history. That meant a lower population and less leisure time all around. Today, versions of these films can be seen in short form, playing at Disney hotels or on Disney Channel or on Disney+. It might not be Disney's most recognizable era, but the experimentation and new animators added to the team would pave the way for the Silver Age of Disney animation. The Silver Age would take place between 1950 and 1967. These films include Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, Lady and the Tramp, Sleeping Beauty, 101 Dalmatians, The Sword and the Stone, and The Jungle Book. This is the Disney era that most fans romanticize, and it's easy to see why. When many fans think of classic Disney, they think of these films. It also helps to know that these movies were still made under Walt Disney's supervision, with The Jungle Book being the last film that Disney himself had a hand in before his death in 1966. This age is also referred to as the Restoration Age. Walt was still interested in making animation into high art, but also gave way to making these movies more approachable, with a lot of cartoonish gags, music from contemporary artists, and an overall lighter approach to storytelling. Two major artists also helped create the look and feel of this era, Mary Blair and Ivan Earle. They brought a mid-century modern view to the artistry and blended that style with the style of classic fairy tales. This updated color palette and feel for the Silver Age films takes what would otherwise be scary moments and turns them into beautiful art that you can't look away from. Think of Maleficent turning into a dragon and breathing green fire, or maybe Mowgli's encounter with the snake Kaa. Outside of some of the classic villains from this era, Disney animators often steered clear of intense or scary situations on screen. These movies are the family-friendly films that Disney is really known for. They're heartwarming films with happy endings, good morals, and catchy songs. Speaking of music, outside of the previously mentioned contemporary artists like Peggy Lee or Louis Prima, Disney also hired the Sherman Brothers to be the in-house songwriters during this time. Disney had been known for musicals with Snow White previously, but the Sherman Brothers made movie musicals a Disney staple. Their songs are simple enough for kids to remember the lyrics, but complex enough to translate emotion to the audience. Starting with The Sword and the Stone, they would turn the studio into a musical goldmine for the rest of the 1960s and into the 1970s. Their success also bled over into live-action films, something you can hear about in my Live-Action Era's Explained video series. The new artists, the songwriters, Walt's original animators, and so many more made the studio what it was during the Silver Era, turning nearly everything into money. But without Walt, the studio would go almost 2 decades without direction in animation, leading us into the next era. The Bronze Era is the longest period of the 8 eras, spanning from 1970 through 1988. This includes films like The Aristocats, Robin Hood, The Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh, The Rescuers, The Fox and the Hound, The Black Cauldron, The Great Mouse Detective, and Oliver and Company. Also referred to as the Dark Age, the start of the Bronze Era came with Walt Disney's death. And it's a polarizing age in Disney animation. Without Walt to guide the company, animators tried new things. Though this era contains many beloved Disney films, the animation style during this era is highly criticized as cheap and lazy. Xerography, which is a form of copying, started being used lightly during the Silver Age, while Walt became less involved in animation and more focused on his newest legacy, the live-action films and Disneyland. Walt's big downfall during the Silver Era was Sleeping Beauty, which was in production for 10 years and failed to really return money to the studio. So making more films with less money became a necessary action to keep things moving. But after Walt's death, animators clung to this art style as the studio struggled to stay alive. With xerography, animators transferred their drawings directly onto the cells, which at first would only be possible using thick black lines. The look of this black line transfer effect resulted in a third nickname for the films of this era, scratchy films. A major change at this time was an influx of young and new animators from Cal Arts, a school that Walt Disney had a hand in creating. The new, young, hungry artists clashed with the elder, established team, as they wanted to really try out new ideas. They wanted to make darker, edgier films that would appeal to teens and adults, while the established team was looking to continue Walt's legacy with musical fairy tales made cheaply and quickly. Due to the infighting at the studio, most of the films weren't a commercial success at the box office, and none did worse than The Black Cauldron, which sacrificed its tone to appease both the young and old animators at the studio. Disney's animation team was successful during this time, but not because of anything new coming from the studio. Re-releases of classic Disney films in theaters and the sale of new VHS home movies drove the studio and afforded them the ability to make new films. But most people would have rather watched Dumbo or Peter Pan than anything new from Disney at that time. The studio had a stigma that it just couldn't shake. But Disney animation prevailed and brought us to what is one of the most successful eras, the Disney Renaissance, from 1989 through 1999. This era includes The Little Mermaid, The Rescuers Down Under, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan, and Tarzan. During this time, Disney shuffled around executives and put fresh leaders in roles that would see them succeed. Michael Eisner and Frank Wells were hired from other studios to be the CEO and COO. Jeffrey Katzenberg was brought in to head up the film department and oversee what was happening at Disney Animation. During this time, music became a vital ingredient, arguably more so than any era before it. Much like we saw with the Sherman Brothers classics, the songwriting duo Howard Ashman and Alan Menken essentially wrote the soundtrack of the millennial generation. Films from this time had a Broadway formula, which allows most of these musicals to translate to the stage thanks to the theater background that Ashman and Menken brought to the table. Howard Ashman in particular believed that you could move the story with music and evoke emotion without talking, something that animation could do more than any other film art form. And that motto stuck with nearly every single film of this era. Disney animators took the best from every era before them as well. They experimented with computers more, fine-tuned the hand-drawn animation look, and brought in major stars to voice characters. During the 70s and 80s, Disney had released a new animated film every few years, but under Katzenberg, the company built momentum by releasing a new film pretty much every year. And something that Disney had built their studio around were princess movies. Both Snow White and Cinderella had been major hits for the company and helped revitalize the studio in times where it needed the revitalization. But the studio hadn't made a princess film since 1960's Sleeping Beauty, and the Disney Renaissance brought the Disney princess back. Thanks to this era, princesses have now become synonymous with the Disney brand. It's not really a mystery why so many Disney fans regard this era as their favorite. Not only was Disney able to grow their team both in numbers and in technology at this time, but all of these films continuously were praised for their musical numbers, their colorful characters, and their moral themes. And the success of these animated films bled into every other avenue that Disney had. The Disney Store, which launched in the 1980s, sold tons of shirts and toys. Many of the characters from the big screen then gained TV shows, and the Disney parks would see these characters join parades and greet guests. Unfortunately, the highs of the Renaissance would eventually implode by the beginning of the 21st century. There are plenty of names for this next era, but I think it's served best by calling it the post-Renaissance, which lasted from 2000 to 2007. This era includes Fantasia 2000, Dinosaur, The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis the Lost Empire, Lilo and Stitch, Treasure Planet, Brother Bear, Home on the Range, Chicken Little, and Meet the Robinsons. Disney animators were once again trying to redefine themselves, much like they did during the Bronze Era, which is why the post-Renaissance era is also referred to as the Second Dark Age or the Experimental Era. After the deaths of Frank Wells and Howard Ashman, as well as the departure of Jeffrey Katzenberg to go create DreamWorks Animation, the studio lost its way. Disney also started a working partnership with Pixar in the mid-90s, and with Pixar's fully computer-generated movies now on the scene, it challenged Disney's animation team to update their look for a modern era. Disney continued to push their use of computer animation during this time, while also holding on to their roots in hand-drawn animation. The result was clunky and left the films without a real focus. Not enough money was really poured into the new computer animation, which didn't age well over time. For example, Treasure Planet is a beautiful movie, but in moments when hand-drawn and computer animation blend on screen, it's very clear which style is which. Or a movie like Chicken Little had so much emphasis on computer animation that it failed to have a worthy Disney story. Despite a younger generation growing up on these films and loving them, they weren't as critically or commercially viable for Disney. That meant that these movies have mostly been forgotten by the company. Unlike the films of the Renaissance, these movies didn't receive much in terms of theme park presence or toy sales. The only standout from this time that did get that treatment was Lilo and Stitch, a weird runaway success that doesn't necessarily fit the classic Disney fairy tale. By the mid-2000s, a changing of Disney executives, including Bob Iger taking over as head of the company, and John Lasseter from Pixar running both Disney and Pixar Animation after a Disney buyout, would lead to greater success once again with the Revival Era, from 2008 to 2019. This era includes Bolt, Princess and the Frog, Tangled, Winnie the Pooh, Wreck-It Ralph, Frozen, Big Hero 6, Zootopia, Moana, Ralph Breaks the Internet, and Frozen 2. I know that some people prefer to put Bolt in the previous post-Renaissance era, especially since it's been mostly forgotten by Disney and didn't make a ton of money, but it did do better than previous films. And my reasoning on why it's part of the revival is based on John Lasseter's involvement with this movie and the others going forward. In fact, Lasseter's influence is one of the main defining factors of the revival era, or Disney's second renaissance, as many call it. Disney purchased Pixar in May of 2006 for over $7 billion. With Lasseter's involvement and his love for Walt's storytelling, Disney animators were taught the Pixar way of animation, leading to better-looking computer animation and well-thought-out stories to pair with that animation. Disney would return to the old formula that worked so well during the Renaissance by bringing us 4 new Disney princess movies, but evolved into telling more original stories and adapting material from other sources outside of old books. Zootopia, Moana, and Wreck-It Ralph were all original stories, while Big Hero 6 was adapted from Marvel Comics. These movies have mostly been critical successes, with Frozen and Frozen 2 being the highest grossing animated films of all time. In previous versions of this video, I've seen a ton of comments where people were arguing whether or not this entire era is actually good, because of Disney's move to computer animation or their tendency to push progressive storylines, or the fact that there was overexposure from many of the films in their soundtracks, like Frozen and Frozen 2. But it can't be denied that these movies were box office magic for Disney, and that they opened up other avenues again with theme park ticket sales and merchandise. But where does that leave us now? Because in previous iterations of this video, I thought the revival era ended with Moana, and Jennifer Lee taking over for John Lasseter as head of Disney Animation. But as time has gone on, another major change at Disney has shifted my thinking. Starting in 2021 with Raya and the Last Dragon, new Disney CEO Bob Chapek has put an emphasis on streaming, rather than box office success at the theaters. The streaming era is one to look out for, as Disney isn't just measuring success by critical praise or box office numbers, but they're branching out into streaming with Disney+, charging a premium price to see a new animated movie early. Thanks to the 2020 pandemic, we won't know the outcome of this era, or if it's really the next era, but Bob Chapek is interested in pushing forward with Disney+, and taking advantage of a direct-to-consumer approach rather than sharing any profits with movie theaters. I received a ton of comments in the past talking about this new era at Disney Animation being the remake era, but that doesn't really track, and it more lines up with Disney's live-action studios. I have to distinctly put those films into the live-action branch of Disney and not in the animation branch, since the animation department is focusing on more new ideas like Raya and the Last Dragon or Encanto, rather than remakes of Aladdin or The Little Mermaid. So if you want to hear more about the remake era in the live-action division, you can check out the link in the description to my live-action eras playlist at the end of this video. The reason for switching to a streaming era is because we can no longer measure a film's success by its monetary value. We instead have to now look at its social success. How many people are talking about this film on social media, or streaming the soundtrack, or watching it on Disney+. Those metrics will allow Disney to know more about those films and what to make next. It'll tell them what kind of merchandise to make, or whether or not guests would be interested in meeting those characters at the parks. They can also see globally what works and what doesn't for different countries. If a movie is a breakout hit in Asia but not in the United States, they can put a focus on merchandise and theme parks in that area of the world and not in the US. The streaming era is a much more calculated era about analytics. But let's hope that those analytics don't lose sight of story, technique, and magic. I've actually done plenty of videos where I talk about each individual era of the animation era, so if you want to see the entire playlist, you can click right here. Also, if you're interested in checking out the Disney live-action eras, click that playlist right there to check those out. And in the next time, my friends, thanks for watching, and keep moving forward.